I never wanted to be a mother, I said that for years, every time the topic came up. Some women dreamed of family, of tiny hands clutching their fingers, of lullabies and birthday parties and school drop-offs. I wasn't one of them. My life was quiet, orderly mine. I built a career, surrounded myself with beautiful things, traveled when I wanted. I had lovers, but never love. That was by design. So when I married Ethan, it wasn't because I wanted a family. It was because he made sense. He was stable, reliable, a man who knew what he wanted and how to get it. We fit together in a way that was comfortable, logical. Love was never the foundation of our marriage, but it didn't need to be. But Ethan had a son, and that changed everything. His name was Lucas. He was 17 when we met. Too old to be a child, too young to be a man, stuck in that strange in-between where boys grow into their sharp edges, but don't yet know how to wear them. The first time I saw him, I thought, this is a boy who has seen too much. He was tall, already nearing Ethan's height, but leaner, his face all angles and shadows. His mother had died years before. Cancer, Ethan told me, with a voice that carried no emotion. Lucas had spent the last few years in boarding school, and before that, with nannies. I hadn't expected him to move in with us. But after our wedding, Ethan insisted. It's time, he said, as if Lucas was an obligation he had been postponing, and so, he arrived. He didn't speak much that first week. He was polite, never rude, never outright hostile, but distant. I understood that. He was 17, uprooted from his life, living in a house with a woman he barely knew. I expected resentment, rebellion, maybe even anger, but what I didn't expect was the way he watched me. First, I thought I imagined it. I'd glance up from my book and catch his eyes flickering away, too fast to be sure. Passing each other in the hallway, his gaze would linger just a moment too long before he turned away. The first time it happened, I brushed it off. The second time, I ignored it. To be why the third, I couldn't. It wasn't a teenage crush. It wasn't awkward fumbling or embarrassment. It was something quieter, heavier. Something I didn't want to name, and then one night, I understood. Ethan was out of town for work. He traveled often, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, leaving the house empty except for me and Lucas. I had gone to bed early, the house dark and still. But sometime after midnight, I woke. A sound. Faint, almost imperceptible, but their breathing. Did I turn my head toward the bedroom door? It was open, just slightly, just enough, and in the shadows beyond, I saw him. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking. Just standing there, silent, watching me. My heart thudded once, twice, hard against my ribs. I didn't speak. Neither did he then. Slowly, the door clicked shut. I lay awake for hours after, my mind spinning, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, but I knew the truth. Something had changed, and it had only just begun. The next morning, I told myself I had imagined it. It was easier that way. I went downstairs and found Lucas already at the kitchen counter, eating breakfast like nothing had happened. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at me when I walked in. Didn't acknowledge me at all. I made coffee, my hand steady, my face composed. But inside, my thoughts twisted over themselves, unraveling the memory of last night. I had felt his eyes on me in the dark. I had seen the way he stood in the doorway, silent, unmoving. That wasn't my imagination, and yet, here he was, acting as if nothing had happened. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was the one reading too much into it. I said nothing, and that was my mistake. The days stretched long and slow. Ethan was still away, and without his presence, the house felt different. It wasn't empty, not really, but the silence was heavier. I was too aware of it. Too aware of him. Lucas didn't avoid me. He didn't go out of his way to be near me, either. But there were moments, small, insignificant moments, that I began to notice, like how he always seemed to be in the same room as me, even when he had no reason to be, or how his gaze would flick to me when he thought I wasn't looking, or how he never broke eye contact. First point, one evening, I found myself alone in the kitchen, pouring a glass of wine. The house was quiet, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I turned to leave, and nearly ran into him, He was standing just inside the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his head tilted slightly as he looked at me. I hadn't heard him come in. My breath caught. "Just for a second, you scared me," I said, forcing a small laugh. He didn't move. Didn't smile. "Just watched me. I didn't mean to," he said, his voice even, unreadable. I took a step back, putting space between us. "Did you need something?" Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he shook his head. "No," he turned and walked away. I exhaled, not realizing until then that I had been holding my breath. I should have let it go, but I didn't. It got worse after that, the almost accidental touches. The glances that lasted too long. The way he would brush past me, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, but never close enough to call it intentional. It wasn't just him. It was me. I was too aware of him. Of his presence, his movements, the way he carried himself with a quiet kind of confidence that didn't belong to someone his age. One night, I caught myself waiting for what? I wasn't sure, but I sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls, and listened to the silence of the house. I told myself I was just unwinding after a long day, that I wasn't listening for the sound of footsteps, that I wasn't wondering if he was awake, and then, as if summoned by my thoughts, he appeared. Lucas walked in, barefoot, his hair slightly tousled like he had just woken up. He wasn't wearing a shirt, just loose sweatpants that hung low on his hips, and for a split second, I forgot how to breathe. "I thought you were asleep," I said. Too quickly, he shrugged. "Couldn't." I swallowed, nodding toward the kitchen. "There's tea if you want some." But he didn't move. Instead, he walked further into the room, slow, deliberate, until he was standing near the couch, just a few feet away. Close enough that I could see the way his gaze moved over me, the way his fingers flexed slightly at his sides. I should have gotten up, I should have said goodnight and left, but I didn't. The silence stretched between us, thick, heavy. Then he said, "You don't have to be scared of me." I frowned. "I'm not." His lips twitched just barely. "Then why do you always run?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. He took a slow step closer. I stood abruptly. "It's late," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You should get some sleep." Lucas watched me for a moment longer. Then, finally, he nodded. "Good night," he murmured, and then he was gone. I let out a shaky breath, pressing my fingers against my temples. This was getting dangerous, and the worst part, I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. I told myself it was nothing. That I was imagining things. That I was the only one making it into something it wasn't. But then Ethan came home. And everything felt worse. At first, I thought it would help, that his presence would reset things, bring the balance back. But it only made the weight of what had been building between me and Lucas feel heavier, like a secret pressed between the walls, waiting to be exposed. Lucas didn't act any differently. Not on the surface. He was polite to his father, distant but respectful, just as he had always been. But when our eyes met across the dinner table, I felt it. The shift. The awareness. The unspoken thing that had started to take root between us. And I hated myself for noticing. Ethan didn't see it. Of course he didn't. He never paid attention to things that weren't about work or himself. His son was a name on a list of responsibilities, an afterthought in a schedule packed with business meetings and late-night calls. He asked the usual questions: how was school? How was everything at home? But he never really listened to the answers. And Lucas knew at one evening, after dinner, I was washing dishes when I felt him behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. I knew it was him. I could feel the heat of his body, the weight of his silence. My pulse quickened. Ethan was upstairs, in his office, a phone pressed to his ear. Lucas didn't speak. He just stood there, close enough that I could feel his presence but not close enough to touch. I could have walked away. I could have pretended not to notice. But I didn't. I stayed there, hands submerged in soapy water, my breath too shallow, my skin too hot. Then, slowly, he reached past me, his arm brushing against mine as he placed his glass in the sink. The touch was barely there, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white. I needed him to leave. I needed him to stop, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned in just slightly, his voice low. "You always hold your breath when I'm close." I exhaled sharply. Lucas, but before I could say another word, he was gone. I stared at the empty space where he had been, my heart pounding. This had to stop. IT was spiraling into something neither of us could come back from. I started avoiding him. Not obviously. Not in a way that Ethan would notice. But I stopped lingering in the kitchen at night. I took my coffee to my office instead of sitting at the breakfast table. I left a room if I felt him enter it, but it didn't matter. He was still there, watching, waiting, testing the space between us. One night, Ethan left for another trip. 3 days. Just me and Lucas in the house again. I told myself it would be fine. That I would keep my distance. That nothing would happen. I was wrong. That I had just gotten out of the shower when I heard a knock at my bedroom door. I froze. My heart leaping into my throat. I wasn't dressed. Just a towel wrapped around me, my hair dripping water onto my bare shoulders. The knock came again. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the towel. Lucas? Silence, then his voice. Yeah. My pulse pounded in my ears. What is it? A pause. Then, I need to ask you something. I hesitated. Can it wait? Another silence. A long one. Then, softly. Please. I shouldn't have opened the door, that I knew that, but I did, just a crack. Just enough to see him standing there, barefoot, his hair slightly messy, like he had been running his hands through it. His expression was unreadable, something careful, something restrained. I gripped the edge of the door, holding it against me. What do you need? His gaze flicked over me, just for a second. Not long enough to be obvious. But I felt it. I need to know, he said quietly, why you keep running. My breath caught. Lucas, this isn't. Don't lie to me. His voice was low, steady. Not now. I swallowed, my throat dry. This is wrong. His jaw tightened. Then tell me to stop. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. His gaze locked onto mine. Something dangerous, something patient. He wasn't going to move first. He wasn't going to cross that last line. He was waiting for me to decide. The air between us was thick, electric. My heart hammered so loudly I thought he might hear it. My fingers curled against the doorframe, every muscle in my body screaming for me to close it. But I didn't. I stayed there, staring at him, feeling the weight of the moment stretch, bend, shift into something neither of us could ignore. And then, finally, he took a step back, not far. Just enough. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. That's what I thought. He turned and walked away, and I shut the door, locked it, pressed my forehead against the wood, my entire body shaking. This had to stop, but I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't, because the worst part wasn't that Lucas had been waiting for me to make a choice. The worst part was that I hadn't made the right one. The next morning, I woke up with a headache. The kind that wasn't caused by anything physical, but by the weight of something pressing down on me, something I didn't want to name. I moved through my morning routine in a daze, avoiding the mirror, avoiding my own reflection, because I knew what I would see there. Guilt. Or worse, something that wasn't guilt at all. Lucas was already in the kitchen when I walked in. Sitting at the counter, coffee in front of him, eyes on his phone. He looked up when I entered, but he didn't say anything. Just watched. Like he was waiting. I ignored him. Poured myself a cup of coffee, keeping my movements steady, controlled. But my hands weren't steady. And I knew he noticed. I took my coffee and went to the patio, needing the cool morning air, needing space. I sat in the chair, exhaling slowly, staring out at the yard without really seeing it. I told myself I was stronger than this, that I could fix it, that if I just put enough distance between us, if I stopped acknowledging the tension, it would fade. I was wrong, because Lucas followed me. I heard the sliding door open, the soft scrape of his footsteps on the stone. I didn't look at him, didn't react when he sat in the chair next to me. Too close, always too close. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, but I refused to be the one to break it. Lucas sighed, a soft exhale. Are you going to pretend forever? I stared ahead. I don't know what you're talking about. He huffed a quiet laugh. You're a terrible liar. I clenched my jaw, fingers tightening around my mug. Lucas, stop. Stop what? His voice was calm, measured. Saying out loud what you're already thinking? My breath hitched just slightly, but it was enough. He saw it. I knew he did. His chair creaked as he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. He wasn't looking at me anymore, but his presence was still suffocating. You keep running, he murmured. But I think we both know you don't want to. I closed my eyes, counted to 5. Then I stood. I walked back inside, without another word. I didn't hear him follow. But I knew this wasn't over. I stayed in my room most of the day, keeping my distance, keeping things safe, keeping him away. But it wasn't really distance, not when I was still thinking about it. Not when I was still feeling it. The memory of last night, of the way he had looked at me, the way he had stepped back, waiting for me to make a choice. I couldn't shake it. I couldn't stop hearing his voice. Then tell me to stop. But I hadn't. The realization sent a sharp jolt through me, something cold, something terrifying. I had to get out of this house. I told Lucas I was running errands. He didn't ask questions, just watched as I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. I should have driven somewhere far. But instead, I ended up at a coffee shop 10 minutes away, sitting by the window, stirring a drink I didn't even want. I needed air, space, distance. But even here, I couldn't escape it. I kept replaying every moment, every interaction, trying to figure out where things had shifted. How I had let them. How I had lost control. Maybe it had been gradual. Maybe it had been inevitable. Maybe I had been lying to myself all along. I didn't go back home right away. I sat there, letting the hours slip by, watching people come and go, trying to remind myself what normal felt like. But normal didn't exist anymore. Not in that house. Not between us. It was late when I finally returned. The house was dark, quiet, but I knew he was still awake. I could feel it. I moved carefully, silently, like I was afraid of waking something I didn't want to face. I made it to my room, exhaling in relief. And then I saw it. The note. A small slip of paper on my nightstand, next to my lamp. I swallowed, fingers trembling slightly as I picked it up. For words, scrawled in his messy handwriting. You can't run forever. My stomach twisted. I clenched the paper in my hand, my heartbeat loud in my ears. This wasn't just something I could ignore anymore. Lucas wasn't going to let me. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted to. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, gripping the sheets so tightly my knuckles ached. The note was still on my nightstand. The words burned into my mind. Impossible to ignore. You can't run forever. I told myself I wasn't scared. That this wasn't dangerous. That I could still control it. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. This had already slipped past control. Lucas wasn't a child. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what he was doing. And I hated that I was starting to wonder if he had known all along. How long had he been watching me like that? How long had I ignored the warning signs? How long had I wanted to ignore them? I didn't have the answers. I wasn't sure I wanted them. I avoided him the next morning. Stayed in my room. Waited until I was sure he had gone downstairs before slipping out to shower. I needed distance. Time to think. Time to figure out how to undo whatever had started between us before it was too late. But when I walked into the kitchen, Lucas was already there, sitting at the counter, fingers tapping against the surface, a lazy kind of patience in his expression, like he knew I had been trying to avoid him and was amused by it. Morning, he said, voice casual. I ignored him. Poured myself coffee. Focused on my breathing, on keeping my hands steady, on pretending I hadn't spent the entire night thinking about that stupid note. Lucas didn't speak for a while. Just watched. Just waited then. Finally, he said, "Did you get my note?" I exhaled slowly. Lucas, just answer the question. I turned, meeting his gaze for the first time that morning.
"Yes," I said.
I got it. Something flickered in his eyes. Something unreadable. And what? His fingers tapped against the counter again. Slow. Deliberate. Are you done running? I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. You think this is a game? Lucas tilted his head slightly, studying me.
"No," he said.
I don't. I hated the way my stomach twisted at that. Hated the way his voice sounded so steady, so certain, like he wasn't afraid of what this was turning into. Like he had already decided how it would end. I needed to shut this down. Now, this stops here, I said firmly. Whatever you think is happening, whatever you think you want, it's not real. You're just… don't. His voice was quiet. Sharp, and I froze. Lucas pushed away from the counter, standing up. He wasn't touching me, but I felt the shift. The way the air between us got heavier. Don't talk to me like I'm a kid who doesn't know what he's feeling. His jaw tightened. You know that's not true. I swallowed hard. Lucas, you feel it too, he said, and I hated him for saying it out loud because we both knew it was true, that I didn't answer him. I turned and walked away, locking myself in my room, pressing my palms against the door as if that would keep whatever was happening from following me inside. I needed Ethan to come home. I needed the balance to return. I needed Lucas to stop looking at me like that. But when night came and I lay in the dark, I knew none of those things were going to happen because even with my door locked, I could still feel him, still feel the weight of his presence in the house, still feel the pull of something. I wasn't supposed to want it. I squeezed my eyes shut. Force myself to breathe evenly. Force myself to sleep, but sleep never came. The next day, I went out. I didn't tell Lucas where I was going.
I didn't owe him that.
But as I got into the car, I caught sight of him watching from the living room window, arms crossed, an expression I couldn't quite place. I drove for hours, wandering through stores, sitting in coffee shops, anything to avoid going home. But eventually I had to. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. Quiet. I told myself I was relieved. I wasn't. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The silence felt thick, pressing in on me. I exhaled slowly, walking toward the stairs. Then I felt it, the shift in the air. I turned. Lucas stood at the bottom of the staircase, half in the shadows, watching me for a long moment. Neither of us spoke. Then he said, "Did running help?" I inhaled sharply. "Lucas, stop." "Stop what?" "This." I gestured vaguely between us, my pulse too loud in my ears. "Whatever you think this is." His expression didn't change. "You know exactly what this is?" I shook my head.
No.
"No, I don't." He took a step forward. "You do?" Another step. I backed up instinctively, my spine pressing against the door. Lucas stopped, watching me. His voice was soft when he said, "Tell me you don't want this." My breath caught. "Tell me to stop." He had said that before. And I hadn't. I swallowed. Forced my voice to steady. "I don't." Silence then. After what felt like forever, Lucas nodded. "Okay." He turned and walked away. I stood there, my entire body trembling, my fingers gripping the doorknob like it was the only thing keeping me upright. I had said no.